In the early morning hours of Saturday, February 29, 1964, firefighters responded to a call at 14612 133rd Street, South Ozone Park, Queens. This was the residence of Calvin Johnson and his 24-year-old wife, Annie Mae. Annie Mae's twin sisters, Arline and Erline, lived on the second floor with Erline's baby daughter. Calvin worked for a food service company located near LaGuardia Airport. He had to be to work at 3:30 a.m. The Johnsons had only one car, and Annie Mae needed it the next day, so she drove Calvin to work. 14612 133rd Street, South Ozone Park, points to this vacant lot. From this perspective, it's apparent that a house is missing. Notice the proximity of Kennedy Airport in the background. This is a street view of the vacant lot where the Johnson house stood in 1964. This photo of the house, along with those on either side, provides a reference to where that house was before it was razed. The front of the house to the east has been renovated, but these windows on the upper floor and the chimney are the same. The roof lines on both houses are the same. And this utility line connection appears to be the same or very similar. Around 4 a.m., Arline and Erline were awakened by the crying of the baby. They smelled smoke and quickly realized the house was on fire. Erline grabbed her baby and ran next door. Arline followed. As she ran through flames in the living room, she saw Annie Mae laying on the floor. She dragged her onto the front porch. Erline returned with the neighbor, and together they carried Annie Mae to her car. The roof line, second floor windows, and entrance of this house to the west match, and this is likely the same tree. The police were arriving as the firemen were leaving. Upon their arrival, they found the house severely damaged, yet no one was injured except Annie Mae. Despite showing only minor burns, Annie Mae had died, they assumed, from smoke inhalation. The medical examiner determined she died from several stab wounds, probably from an ice pick. Police investigated the murder, and once they had cleared her husband Calvin, they had no suspects, motive, or clues. The case quickly went cold. 2 weeks later, on Friday, March 13, 1964, 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese left the tavern she managed, Ev's 11th Hour, to drive home to her apartment in Kew Gardens, Queens. She had been out with a friend from Ev's, who dropped her off back at the tavern where she had left her car. Ev's 11th Hour was located at 19314 Jamaica Avenue in Hollis, Queens. This is a street view look from 2020 at 19314 Jamaica Avenue. In 1964, this small grocery store was Ev's 11th Hour. Around 3 a.m., Kitty left the bar and walked to her red 1963 Fiat to drive home. It was roughly 5 miles to the west, and with no traffic at 3 a.m., about a 15-minute drive. Jamaica Avenue looking east. Jamaica Avenue looking west. As she got into her car, she was spotted by a predator prowling the streets of Queens. Kitty was just what he was looking for, a lone female. She drove away, and he followed at a distance. He drove a white 1960 Chevrolet Corvair. He wore gloves, a stocking cap, and in a pocket of his overcoat, he carried a large hunting knife. Kitty went west on Jamaica Avenue, north on 188th Street, then west on Grand Central Parkway. She exited near Austin Street, then took Austin south to her apartment, unaware of the evil that followed. Kitty lived with her roommate and partner, Mary Ann Zalanko, in an apartment at the northwest corner of Austin Street and Lefferts Boulevard in Kew Gardens, Queens. Kitty's apartment was only a mile from the Forest Hills locations of two of the Son of Sam shootings, which would take place 13 years later in 1977. Kitty and Mary Ann's apartment was in this Tudor building here at 8270 Austin Street in Kew Gardens. Access to the second floor apartments was via narrow stairways off a walkway at the back of the building. This is a photo of Mary Ann sitting on the walkway. Steps up to Lefferts Boulevard are visible behind her. Kitty parked her Fiat in the parking lot of the Long Island Railroad Kew Gardens station. Two sources I found show that she parked here. However, this photo shows her car parked here. The Corvair driver parked here on Austin Street at a bus stop. This is a street view of Austin Street looking east towards Lefferts Boulevard. This area is virtually the same as it was in 1964. The parking lot for the Long Island Railroad Kew Gardens stop is here. Kitty's apartment was in this Tudor building. The Corvair was parked here at this bus stop. Here's another look at Kitty's car in the parking lot. Whether she was parked there or here, the killer had a good view of her. As Kitty got out of her car, she noticed the man standing at the northwest corner of the parking lot. As she started across the lot toward the walkway to her apartment, he started to follow. When she saw that he was after her, she changed course and headed for the front of the building on Austin Street and broke into a sprint. She began screaming for help. He caught her here and pounced on her back, dragging her down and stabbing her. She shrieked, "Oh my God, he stabbed me! Help me! Somebody please help me!" As he continued to stab at her, lights started coming on in the 10-story Mowbray apartment building across the street. A male voice shouted, "Shut the f*** up!" Another man yelled, "What's going on down there? Leave that girl alone." That interrupted the assault. Kitty lay wounded and bleeding on the sidewalk. The attacker, now alarmed, ran west down Austin Street back to his car. The car was parked here at this bus stop. He drove west on Austin Street in reverse to the first intersection at 82nd Road. He backed the car around the corner onto 82nd Road. Where he sat and waited. Kitty lay wounded here. The killer waited here, out of sight. Kitty, seriously, but not mortally wounded, lay on the sidewalk bleeding heavily. Now sobbing and calling for help, she cried out, "If someone doesn't help me, I'm going to die." No one came. She managed to get up, stumble down Austin Street, and around the corner of the Tudor building. She was not attacked here, as was later reported. Many residents of the Mowbray apartment building on Austin Street heard Kitty's screams. Some looked out their windows and saw the attack. Some didn't see anything but heard the screams. People looking out of their windows in this building overlooking the parking lot watched Kitty stumble around the building. The witness aspect of the crime will be discussed later. Eventually, she made it around the building to the walkway that led to her home. The first door around the corner belonged to a coffee shop. The door next to it at 8262 led up to the apartment of her friend, 31-year-old Carl Ross. This photo shows a clear view of the rear of the Tudor building. Kitty's apartment door is here. The door to Carl Ross's apartment is here. That's as far as Kitty got. She pushed the door open and collapsed in the vestibule at the base of the stairway. She cried out, "Carl! Carl, please help me. I'm stabbed." Instead of calling the police, Carl called a friend and asked her what he should do. She told him to call the police. He heard Kitty again frantically calling, "Carl, it's Kitty. I've been stabbed. Please help me." Instead of calling the police, he climbed out a window onto the roof to beckon a neighbor. Instead of calling the police, they called a woman named Greta Schwartz, a building resident who lived near Kitty. Meanwhile, back in his car on 82nd Road, the killer changed his stocking cap to a fedora and, hearing no sirens, returned to the scene to find his victim and to complete his mission to murder and rape her. He looked in doorways along Austin Street, then checked the train depot. Finding nothing and about to give up, he decided to check the rear of the Tudor building. Inside the second doorway, he found Kitty laying on the floor. She screamed. He stabbed her in the neck to stop the screaming. He cut through her clothing, and she continued to resist. He slashed her breast and stabbed her several more times until she was still. He then lifted her skirt, cut through her remaining undergarments, and sexually assaulted her. When he was finished with her, he left her to die, brutally assaulted and bleeding on the cold concrete floor. He casually walked east to Lefferts Boulevard, then left to Austin Street, and Austin Street back to 82nd Road and his car. Greta Schwartz wondered why Carl would be calling her in the middle of the night. Something about Kitty being hurt or drunk. She hurried down to the other end of the building, to the door leading to Carl's apartment. It was dark and she couldn't really see Kitty until she bent down to help her. What she saw took her breath away. She was unable to scream. She wondered how Kitty could be alive, how anyone could survive that carnage. She ran back to her apartment and called Sophie Farrar. Sophie rushed downstairs and met Greta. They ran to Carl's doorway and she pushed her way into the vestibule. It took a moment in the darkness for Sophie to see Kitty. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees and cradled Kitty in her arms. Kitty instinctively reacted like a wounded animal and feebly attempted to fight her off. Sophie managed to calm her down and comfort her. Carl Ross poked his head out of his doorway. Sophie told him to call the police. At 3:50 a.m., Carl Ross finally called the police. That call was received at the 102nd Precinct House on 118th Street in Richmond Hill, Queens. A police officer arrived at the crime scene within 2 minutes. Upon seeing the horror at the scene, the officer immediately radioed the precinct to send an ambulance and detectives. 2 detectives arrived at 4:05 a.m. 2 more detectives arrived at 4:20. The ambulance didn't arrive until 4:25. In 1964, there were no EMTs, just an ambulance driver and attendant. Kitty, still clinging to life, was loaded into the ambulance and taken to Queens General Hospital. She was declared dead on arrival and was taken straight to the hospital morgue. Because of the 2 large apartment buildings and other residents at the site and the large number of potential witnesses they may hold, the ranking detective at the scene requested assistance from all precincts in Queens for detectives to immediately begin canvassing residents of the area. By 7 a.m., 40 detectives and technicians were at work. By 9 a.m., the police had enough information from witnesses to feel confident that they knew what had happened and they had a description of the killer. After several days of combing the area for clues and conducting hundreds of interviews and re-interviews, the police investigation was at a standstill. They had no suspects, clues, or motive, and knew that any chance of solving this case would only come if the killer struck again. Wednesday morning, March 18th, 5 days after the Kitty Genovese murder, a man named Raoul Cleary saw a thin, young, light-skinned black man calmly carry a TV out of his neighbor Everett Bannister's house, located at 2334 102nd Street in East Elmhurst, Queens. This is a 2019 street view of the house at 2334 102nd Street, from which the man was seen stealing a television. The man put the TV into a white Corvair. Mr. Cleary asked why he was taking the Bannisters' TV. He said it was okay, he was helping them move. When the man walked back into the Bannisters' house, Raoul Cleary checked with another neighbor, Jack Brown. Jack Brown knew the Bannisters weren't moving, so Mr. Brown called the police, and Mr. Cleary removed the distributor cap from the Corvair. When the young man returned to the car and was unable to start it, he casually walked away down 102nd Street. Shortly thereafter, a squad car arrived at the scene. Mr. Cleary and Mr. Brown rode with the officers searching for the burglar. Around 11:30, they found him 6 blocks away, walking along 23rd Avenue. The officers put him into the squad car and drove back to the Corvair. In the Corvair, they found 2 televisions, some small appliances, and a large collection of pornographic photos. He was arrested and taken to the 114th Precinct House on Astoria Avenue in Astoria, Queens. He gave his name and address as Winston Moseley, 13319 Sutter Avenue, South Ozone Park, Queens. He lived there with his wife and 2 small children. He was 29 and did not have a record of any prior arrests. He held a good job as a Remington Rand punch card programmer, and with his wife, who was a nurse, they had a substantial yearly income. He was polite, soft-spoken, and intelligent, the opposite of the typical burglar. Moseley admitted to 2 burglaries that morning and at least 20 to 30 over the previous year. He also admitted to 4 recent sexual assaults. The Astoria detectives knew that police in Kew Gardens were looking for the driver of a white Corvair in regards to a homicide the previous Friday. When he was accused of stabbing Kitty Genovese and pressed about wounds on his hands, Moseley quietly admitted, "Okay, I killed her." He then calmly proceeded to tell the detectives the story of the Kitty Genovese murder starting on the morning of Thursday, March 12th. This is an extremely blown-out street view of the house on Sutter Avenue in South Ozone Park that was home to Winston Moseley, his wife Betty, their 2 young children, and 5 dogs. It's on the corner of Sutter Avenue and 134th Street. That morning he went to work as usual. For the last 10 years, Moseley had worked at the Raygram Corporation, located on East Kingsbridge Road in the northern suburb of Mount Vernon. It was about a 20-mile, 35-minute drive. The Raygram Corporation was located in this building on East Kingsbridge Road in Mount Vernon. Moseley stated that he threw Kitty Genovese's wallet into some bushes by where he parked that morning. He also mistakenly threw a business card for Al's TV and radio repair into the bushes with the wallet. After work, he stopped by his father's shop, Al's TV and radio repair, I wasn't able to find an address for the shop. The most specific was Northern Boulevard in Corona, Queens, which, according to Queens area maps, is impossible as Northern Boulevard does not pass through Corona. So it was probably somewhere in this area. Moseley typically stopped there after work before heading home. He arrived home around 9 p.m., about the same time his wife was leaving for work. He had decided he wanted to go out that night to find a woman to kill. Around 1 a.m., he left his children at home alone and went out hunting. Around 3 a.m., while cruising down Jamaica Avenue, he saw a woman get into a little red car alone. He turned around and followed. He proceeded to tell the rest of the story of how he twice assaulted Kitty Genovese and left her to die inside the doorway at 8262 Austin Street. During further questioning, one detective said, "Tell me, Moseley, besides Kitty, who else did you kill?" Moseley surprised them by confessing that he had killed 2 other young women. He said that late on Friday, February 28th, he felt the urge to kill and rape a woman. Despite a snowstorm and bad roads, Moseley left his 2 young children home alone in the early morning to hunt for a victim. Because of the weather, he stayed close to home. After a couple hours of cruising the area, he saw a woman alone in a Chevrolet exit the Van Wyck Expressway. Annie Mae Johnson was returning home after driving her husband to work. He followed her to her home at 14612 133rd Avenue in South Ozone Park. As she got out of her car, he approached her holding a .22 caliber rifle. He told her to give him her money. She gave him her wallet, and he shot her in the stomach. She doubled over, gave him her keys, and begged him to take her into the house. He took the keys, shot her again, and entered the house, leaving her outside in the cold. He found people asleep upstairs but didn't harm them. He took $100, went back outside, shot Annie Mae Johnson several more times, and removed her clothing. He then took her dead body back into the house, laid her in the living room, and sexually assaulted her. He then set fire to the house and drove home. The detectives were actually disappointed by this confession. Moseley knew details that only the killer could know and even created a drawing of Annie Mae Johnson's home showing where he left her body. However, the autopsy stated that Annie Mae had not been shot to death, but stabbed. Moseley insisted that he had shot her. Her body was later exhumed, and it was found that she had indeed been shot multiple times. In the early morning hours of July 20th, 1963, 8 months prior to the Kitty Genovese attack, 15-year-old Barbara Kralik was stabbed to death as she slept in her bedroom at 17417 140th Avenue, Springfield Gardens, Queens. Moseley told the police, "I did that one too." An 18-year-old acquaintance of Barbara named Alvin Mitchell had already confessed to that killing and was scheduled to go on trial the following month. This is a street view from 2020 of the house in Springfield Gardens where 15-year-old Barbara Kralik was killed. Moseley testified in Mitchell's trial and claimed he killed Barbara Kralik. That trial ended with a hung jury. In Mitchell's second trial, Moseley testified that he didn't kill her and refused to answer any questions. Mitchell was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. On Thursday, March 19, 1964, Winston Moseley was charged with 2 counts of homicide for the Annie Mae Johnson and Kitty Genovese murders, along with illegal possession of a gun and possession of pornography. The judge, Bernard Dubin, reportedly told Moseley, "I can only say it's lucky that our system provides for a trial for a monster like you. What you've done makes me want to vomit." Moseley's trial for the murder of Kitty Genovese began on Monday, June 8, 1964, roughly 3 months after his arrest, a remarkably short amount of time. The trial was held at the Queens County Criminal Courthouse on Queens Boulevard, an 8-minute walk from the Genovese murder site. Moseley pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Jury selection, all arguments, testimony, and statements were complete by Thursday, June 11. just 3 days after it started. Just after midday, the trial went to jury. At 10:30 p.m., the jury returned with a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The following Monday, June 15th, the sentencing hearing was held. The jury recommended the death penalty. Spectators applauded the announcement. The trial judge, J. Irwin Shapiro, told the jurors, "I don't believe in capital punishment, but I must say I feel this may be improper when I see this monster. I wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch on him myself." On July 6, 1964, Moseley was formally sentenced to die in the electric chair. He was taken to Sing Sing State Prison in Ossining, New York, to await execution. Moseley appealed the death sentence, and on June 1, 1967, an appeals court reduced his sentence to life in prison, which also made him eligible for parole. No longer on death row, he was transferred to Attica State Prison near Buffalo, New York. On Thursday, March 14, 1968, Winston Moseley was taken from Attica State Prison to Meyer Memorial Hospital in Buffalo. Moseley had inserted a metal can into his rectum, knowing that the prison doctors wouldn't be able to remove it, and he would have to be hospitalized. At Meyer Memorial Hospital, he underwent minor surgery. 4 days later, on Monday, March 18th, Moseley was being escorted by a single guard out of the hospital to return to prison. He was unrestrained. Moseley punched the guard and ran. He escaped into a residential neighborhood near the hospital. This initiated a massive manhunt. The entire Buffalo area was terrorized by the reporting of a multiple murderer on the loose. He hid out in an empty house located at 278 Dewey Avenue, just 1/2 mile northwest of Meyer Memorial Hospital. Wednesday morning, March 20th, Moseley called an agency and requested a cleaning woman be sent to the house. He held the 22-year-old married mother of 4 hostage, sexually assaulting her. He released her late in the afternoon. He told her if she went to the police, he would kill her children. Thursday, March 21st, the owners of the house, Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Kulaga, returned around 8:15 a.m. Moseley was waiting for them with a handgun he had found in the house. He took them hostage, sexually assaulted Mrs. Kulaga, and left them bound and gagged. He asked how to get back to New York City. Then, wearing Mr. Kulaga's clothes, he headed off in their white 1962 Mercury Comet. Moseley got lost attempting to drive back to New York City. He abandoned the car in Grand Island, a suburb northwest of Buffalo, and set off on foot. In the late morning, he knocked on the door of the second-floor apartment of Mrs. Mary Ann Patmos. With Mrs. Patmos was her infant daughter and a neighbor, Mrs. Gladys Costanzo. Moseley held them hostage at gunpoint. This is a street view from 2021 of the apartment building on Grand Island where Winston Moseley held 2 women and a baby hostage on Thursday, March 21st, 1968. At 11:30, he allowed Mrs. Costanzo to walk to the Trinity Church across the street to pick up their 3-year-old sons at daycare. At the church, Mrs. Costanzo called her husband, who in turn called the FBI. The apartment building was quickly surrounded by dozens of police and FBI personnel. Moseley allowed FBI agent Neil Welch to come into the apartment. After an hour of conversation, Moseley surrendered. This is a photo of FBI agent Neil Welch with Moseley's gun after he surrendered. Visible over his right shoulder is the front of this building, and over his left shoulder is the rear of this building. After his capture in Grand Island, Moseley was returned to Attica State Prison, facing several new charges. In 1971, Moseley participated in the Attica prison uprising. In 1977, he earned a college degree. His requests for parole were denied 18 times. On March 28, 2016, Moseley died at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. He was 81 and had been in prison for 52 years. The murder of Kitty Genovese was extremely brutal. She was stabbed a total of 13 times with a hunting knife. She was stabbed 4 times in the back, 2 of which penetrated her lungs. She was stabbed 9 times on the front of her body, from inner thigh to her neck, including several in her abdomen and 1 in her throat. She had multiple defensive slash wounds to her fingers and 2 deep slashes on her palms. Her clothes were either torn or cut off. Moseley told police that he inserted the blade into her vagina and attempted to cut upward, but was stopped when the knife hit bone. He sexually assaulted her and left her bleeding as he casually walked back to his car with her wallet. These gruesome details became secondary 2 weeks later, on March 27, 1964, when the New York Times published a front-page article headlined, "37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police." Subheadline, "Apathy at Stabbing of Queens Woman Shocks Inspector." The first sentence read, "For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched the killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens." The difference between the 37 and 38 being the call Carl Ross finally made to the police. The article then goes on to describe the crime in detail, and erroneously as 3 separate attacks. It describes Kew Gardens as a peaceful, low-crime, upper-middle-class neighborhood, and how surprised and outraged the police were that none of the witnesses had called them. Ironically, a short blurb regarding a new autopsy for Annie Mae Johnson appeared on the same page as the continuation of the Genovese article. What made this article so significant and the Genovese case so notorious was the lack of response by so many witnesses over such a long period of time. In hindsight, most of the witnesses found it difficult to explain why they hadn't called the police. Due to the explosive nature of this aspect of the story, it did in 1964 what would be considered as going viral today. It was picked up by all the newswire services and was distributed to print, radio, and television media across the United States and the entire world. It should be mentioned that an event in this story has been generally overlooked. If 2 citizens, witnessing a man removing a TV from the house of a neighbor, had chosen not to get involved, Winston Moseley may never have been arrested.